guys, my name is Emily Selleck. I'm a senior reporter at motorsport.com and I'm here in Melbourne after a very exciting start to the F1 season at Albert Park. This is a series that we're calling F1 A Hangover, where I take you inside everything that happened over the past couple of days that you might not have seen on the F1 broadcast. So let's start with Charles Leclerc. The Ferrari driver landed here in Australia and headed to a one-night-only piano bar pop-up as part of his partnership with Chivas Regal. Look, interestingly, he didn't have anyone from Ferrari with him, no security detail, just a couple of mates came along with him. And he was more than happy to talk to a bunch of local influencers and celebrities who were in town. A few actors from the Netflix show Heartbreak High were there. Then he heard there was a French restaurant upstairs, so he headed up and had dinner with his friends, and a couple of lucky Ferrari fans spotted him and got photos, got signatures. It seems like Charles is really in good spirits heading into this F1 season. And across the garage, his new teammate, Lewis Hamilton, kept things pretty low-key off track this weekend. Unsurprisingly, I think he's very intentionally trying to set the tone that he is really focused on adapting to this car and learning this car. If you read any of our coverage over the past couple of days on motorsport.com, you would have seen that Lewis was telling us he, is still learning what a bunch of the buttons do, has never even driven the car in the wet, was really unsure how it would handle. But he was also very forthcoming about some of his, shortcomings and in areas he had to improve. It was interesting. I don't want to call it a night and day difference, but the way he was with the media over the past couple of days was very different to how we've seen him in recent years. After a decade at Mercedes, he was really able to sort of pick and choose who he spoke to, how much he gave them. But this time around, Lewis was the last one in the media pen. He was being super gracious, answering every question, talking to every reporter. So it was interesting to see. And I think on the other side of the spectrum, we had Max Verstappen, who, if you saw any press conference clips, you might have seen he was, quite short, almost a little bit frosty. We asked him about it and he said, I've just got nothing to say. But I think, it might have something to do with the FIA swearing ban that was imposed last season. We'll sort of see how his demeanour, if it changes over the next couple of races. In terms of other drivers on the grid, we had Oscar and Lando, who were both, very cool, calm and collected, both in really high spirits. We have Lando, who recently rebranded his clothing line Quadrant, and we saw him doing some work with Ralph Lauren over the past couple of days with their perfume line. And I was curious to see if he would do anything with Quadrant, but I think he might be saving it for perhaps a Silverstone or a couple of races' time. Oscar, if you were here in Melbourne, you would know he was absolutely inescapable between the billboards and the trams, for MasterCard, Jack Daniels, a bunch of the team sponsors. And he was heavily involved with them over the first couple of days here in Melbourne. But by the time the cars hit the track on Friday, his team really pulled him back. He didn't have too many commitments off track, and I think that's something that they might have learned after Daniel Ricciardo was so open about how tough it was here for Aussie drivers. There's lots of pressure and scrutiny. Look, it wasn't Oscar's day in the end. But we spoke to Andrea Stella after the race, and he said Oscar is one of the most level-headed drivers he's ever worked with. And despite a very disappointing result in front of his home crowd, he was still doing okay in high spirits. And given the performance of that McLaren, I think there's no doubt we'll be seeing Oscar on the podium at some point in the not too distant future. Now, speaking of Daniel Ricciardo, he was here this weekend. He had pop-ups for his clothing brand Enchante, and for his wine brand, he launched a new rosé. But he wasn't at the track. I think, that's unsurprising if you've been listening to anything he said recently and some even small fan interactions. I'm sure Cadillac have lots of interest in him, but I don't think he's interested in coming back to the paddock anytime soon. But yeah, he was in Melbourne. We heard that I think Lando was trying to come by the pop-up and there was a bit of pandemonium and that didn't pan out. But, Daniel still has a great relationship with a bunch of drivers on the grid. He was playing paddle with Max, actually not too far from where I am here in South Melbourne. Now let's move our focus to the track itself. So the Australian Grand Prix is actually one of the most attended races for female fans, and the AusGP Corporation noticed this and said, well, let's cater to those people. And so there are a bunch of event sponsors and event partners that I think are pretty non-traditional in the motorsport space. You've got Mecca Max, which is Australia's biggest beauty retailer, sort of like a Sephora, Shark Beauty, which does hair products, even the self-tanning brand Bondi Sands are all involved. And I think it's great to see. I mean, the Albert Park atmosphere is fantastic. If you ever get a chance to come to the Australian Grand Prix, I'd highly recommend it, from the public transport options that are really easy to use, lots of shade, great dining options. Overall, it's a fantastic atmosphere. And one of the ways that the Australian Grand Prix has been embracing, women and other audiences for quite a while is an event called Glamour on the Grid. Now, if you're a fan from somewhere else in the world, you might not have heard of it, but essentially anyone who is anyone, so to say, in Australia, from, influencers and personalities to athletes and Olympians, they all make their way down to Albert Park for this gala that's held in the pit lane, then that moves into the Paddock Club area. And we were there earlier this week. There were certainly a lot of interesting outfits and a lot of interesting personalities. On the Formula One side, we had Michael Massey there, obviously, former race director who we don't see in the paddock too often these days for obvious reasons. We also had Oscar Piastri's family, sort of the first family of Formula One in Australia these days. A couple of F1 trainers, Max Verstappen's trainer, along with Kim Keedle, who used to work with Oscar Piastri. I don't believe he's working with him anymore. Also Hannah St. John, Liam Lawson's partner, and Pierre Gasly's partner, Kika, were also there. And as I mentioned, Daniel Ricciardo, has quite a presence here in Australia. He had a big activation in there for his St. Hugo wine brand. There were some really interesting designs on the wall, and I heard that all the bottles had to be, super glued down because Australians love to have a few drinks, and I think in previous years people have tried to take some souvenirs. So if you tried to pick up anything in this Paddock Club area, I think just about everything was super glued down in place. So there were no souvenirs being taken home this time around. Another thing we heard was that Channing Tatum was meant to be at Glamour on the Grid, and I don't believe he turned up, but Formula One told us a bit later in the week that he would be a guest of theirs on Sunday. So I had my eyes peeled for him both on the starting grid and around the paddock, but he was nowhere to be seen. I then heard he was in the Casa Ferrari hospitality unit not too far away, and he was meant to come to the starting grid, but if you watched the race, you'd know the conditions were quite changeable, and it seems he didn't want to get wet. So he stayed put, and I'm not sure if anyone really had eyes on Channing Tatum, but he was there. The last thing I want to talk about is one of the most visible changes, and that has to do with the LVMH deal that the French conglomerate inked with Formula One. It's a 10-year, $1 billion deal, and this was the first race where we really saw what it looks like in action, so to say. And obviously we had the visible Louis Vuitton branding around the circuit. It was an interesting sort of indigo and gold color. I think fans were a little bit divided over whether they liked that color scheme, and I do think it was quite an interesting choice given those aren't the colors of the brand. It was also seen on the podium next to a sort of moe red, a podium that the drivers stood on. And look, I'm not entirely sure if all those colours kind of worked together in the way they might have hoped. I'm curious to see if they make any tweaks, at China or any races moving forward. And one bit of insight we did have was into the trunk itself that the trophies are carried in. Our seats in the media centre were right next to this room where we saw about 30 people coming and going throughout the course of the 4 days. God knows what they were doing. They were photographing the trunk, they were moving it, obviously, with white gloves. There was lots going on, but I guess one thing to note about LVMH is that they, own some of the most respected brands in the world, you could say, and everything they do is, very intentional, lots of attention to detail. So I'm curious to see sort of how this deal, rolls out, because these are some of the, the most prestigious, luxurious brands in the world, but that is, of course, how Formula One is wanting to position itself. So there definitely is a lot of synergy there. Look, that's where I'm going to leave it, guys, but thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any feedback, anything you'd like to see in future. Happy to talk more about sort of the conversations that I have with drivers across the weekend, team principals, people in the paddock, but looking forward to bringing you some more behind the scenes details throughout this F1 season.